Chamamos agora ao palco o mediador de nossa segunda conferência de hoje, Vladimir Sapato.
Então, bem, mais uma vez, obrigado pela presença de todos vocês. Boa tarde. Nós vamos, então, ter uma sessão de apresentações com a professora Wendy Brown, professora Fábian, e com a debatedora, a professora Rahel. Eu vou apresentar, então, um pouco o livro de cada um dos professores. Como me foi entregue um texto em inglês, então acho mais fácil ler diretamente em inglês, né? Wendy Brown is class of 1936, first professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is also affiliated with the interdisciplinary graduate program of critical theory. A scholar of historical and contemporary political theory, her most recent books are Walled States, One in Sovereignty, 2010, The Power of Tolerance with Heiner Force, 2013, and Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism, Stealth Revolution, 2015. Professor Rodrigo de la Fábian is Associate Professor and Director of the Doctoral Program in Psychology of the Faculty of Psychology at the University of Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile. He is a member of the Executive Board of the International Society for Psychoanalysis and Philosophy, and his recent publications include Positive Psychology's Promise of Happiness, A New Form of Human Capital in Contemporary Neoliberalism, Governmentality, in Theory and Psychology, with Antonio Stecker, 2017, De l'impératif du bonheur dans le néolibéralisme contemporain, une lecture psychanalytique du nouvel esprit du capitalisme. Well, this is a magazine in Slovene. I cannot say philosophical vesting. Yeah, it's impossible. Yeah? But it's a good one, very good. Yeah? Nuevos discursos acerca de la felicidad y gobernabilidad neoliberal. Ocúpate de ser feliz y todos los demás vendrá por añadidura, with Antonio Stecker, Sociedad Hoy, in 2015, and de la irreductible presencia del salvaje robesiano en la obra de Sigmund Freud, revista Aurora, 2014. And Rahel Jaeggi has been a professor for practical philosophy with emphasis on social philosophy and critical theory at the Humboldt University in Berlin since 2009. She's taught at the Goethe University Frankfurt for 1998 to 2009. In 2002-2003, she was visiting assistant professor at Yale University. In 2015-2016, she was Theodor Heuss professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. In 2012, she was visiting professor at Fudan University, Shanghai. Her areas of specialization are social philosophy, critical theory, political philosophy, ethics, philosophical anthropology, and social ontology. Her recent publications include Alienation, with English translation 2016, Nach Marx, Philosophie, Kritik, Praxis, edited with Daniel Loic, 2013, and Kritik von Lebensformen, 2013, with English translation for Coming, and Basiskritik, edited with Tito Wechsel, 2009. Okay, then we begin with the conference of Professor Wendy Brown.
Thank you, Vladimir. It's an enormous pleasure to be here in this remarkable space, in this remarkable setting. I will not go through all the thanks, the gratitude that I think each of us has. Just mention that to the organizers, to the Sesc staff, and of course to the interpreters, both those standing before you, the sign language interpreters, and those translating behind the scenes, without whom we could not communicate. I'm going to frustrate the prepared translators by adding just a few remarks to the beginning of the talk that they have. These are, of course, incredibly disorienting times politically. So much is happening in high and in low politics that we literally did not think was possible. This is, among other things, I think, a reminder to those of us who claim not to believe in progress that we actually did. It's evident in our conviction, now broken, that certain things surely were behind us that now are in the streets. And that in turn, I think, leads us to a reminder from Walter Benjamin. The passage I'm about to quote, I think, is quoted 1,000 times a day these days. A reminder from him that we have to grasp deeply what bewilders and assaults us, that we can't just be appalled, we have to become comprehending. Otherwise, what use are we intellectuals? The statement from Benjamin, of course, is this: the current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. What Benjamin meant, I think, is that to be philosophical means to confront what seems impossible, what seems amazing, what seems horrific, to confront it by trying to fathom it, trying to know it. And I would add that this knowledge now, of course, extends beyond philosophical knowledge. To fathom what's happening today will be obtained through genealogies, through political economy, through tracking logics and predicates and grammars and ascendant discourses and crises and contingencies. I did not say causes. We critical thinkers aren't looking simply for causes. We're looking for all that has made these eruptions, these times that are so disorienting, yes, appalling. What has made them possible? Our task is to figure that out. Now, of course, none of us can do this comprehensively. We need each other, which is what makes a conference like this so important. There are many pieces, many strands. Nobody's got the thing. Nobody's got the truth. And to that end, I'm very pleased to be sharing this afternoon with Rodrigo, whose work I think is astonishing. All right. My second preface that wasn't in the original paper, I have written out, and it goes like this. It's a response to that confusion we have about how a conference like this, a conference on democracy, could be called a gathering of communists by Brazilian right-wing protesters. Some of us are pleased and proud to be anointed this way, but not all of us. So our question, my question, how does our subject, the ends of democracy, a subject presumably motivated by concern that neither actually existing democracy nor hopes for more radical versions, come to an end? How do these concerns become aligned with what I take the right wing to be saying, which is that communism's darkest iterations, Cold War democracy's putative opposite, that's what we embody. What makes this inversion, our concern with democracy, hanging on to it, extending it, enriching it, deepening it, radicalizing it, clinging to it, what makes the inversion of that set of cares possible, legible in our time? And I'm offering one tiny strand of an answer in the paper that I'm giving today, and I'll just give you the précis before I move into it. The answer to how this inversion is possible in our time goes roughly like this in my paper. Through neoliberal rationality, a form of reason, a form of reconceptualization of democracy and capitalism, the social and the subject, democracy's meaning and practice have come to be equated on the one hand with markets, and on the other, with an expanded and protected space for traditional morality. When this rationality becomes hegemonic, when it claims the mantle of democracy, political challenges to the unalloyed rule of markets and traditional morality become rendered as illegitimate meddling in the lives of free individuals and tyrannical repression of the spontaneous order generated by markets and morals. Social justice warriors, as the right names us in the global north, and as we are named in this rationality, social justice warriors become barely masked advocates of totalitarianism, whether we're trying to tax wealth or redistribute the privileges that go traditionally with whiteness, maleness, and Christianity. Social democracy within this rationality is cast as tyranny, taxes are theft, egalitarianism is social engineering, the stuff of fascism. Still in this rationality, society itself is a fiction, and public goods should be tossed on the dust heap of socialist stupidities. This sea change means that today we're battling over the semiotics and the ownership of democracy. We are not just battling over democracy versus anti-democracy, or liberal versus illiberal democracy, or democracy versus authoritarianism. In fact, I would argue, few on the right, including the extreme right, understand themselves as non-democrats. Few on the right understand themselves as authoritarians. Rather, they understand themselves as the true Democrats fighting a tyrannical left that has and would continue to trammel freedom and moral tradition with social justice according to our norms and backed by the coercive state. So from this perspective, we are all communists, including those of you who are only liberal Democrats. Come on down. Moreover, for a right born out of and formed by neoliberal rationality, the nation becomes an all-important theater and container. The nation, hence nationalism, becomes all that produces political identity and cohesion when society has been dismantled and the space it evacuates is filled with markets on the one side and an enlarged sphere for traditional morality on the other. So in this new order of things, society becomes the name of a left platform of justice, enacted by statism, inevitably leading to socialism, indefinite in its boundaries, open to all, abandoning protection of markets, morals, and white maleness. In counterpoint, the nation becomes the theater of freedom and morality. It harbors private property and prerogative, tradition, exclusion, and rightful exercise of state power to secure these things, both inside and out. So that's the arc, that's the précis of the argument I'm about to make, and I'm going to make it by focusing mainly on one thinker who brought us here, Friedrich Hayek, and mainly by concentrating, with apologies, on the Euro-Atlantic world. Not exclusively, but mainly. Now, here's the paper you actually have. White working and middle class backlash against socioeconomic dethronement by neoliberal economic policy and what Marine Le Pen termed savage globalization is rampant across the Euro-Atlantic and, of course, parts of the global south too. Declining access to decent incomes, housing, schools, pensions, and futures has given rise to rebellion against imagined dark usurpers and against the cosmopolitans and the elites that they hold responsible for throwing open the doors of their nations and throwing them away. This much we know. But what's the political form of this anger and its mobilization? The old terms commonly bandied about to describe it, populism, authoritarianism, fascism, seem to me to inadequately capture the strange brew of bellicosity, disinhibition, and anti-democratic license and support for statism in the current one. Nor do these old terms identify the specific elements of neoliberal reason, a radically extended reach of the private, mistrust of the political, disavowal of the social, which together normalize inequality and disembowel democracy. These elements shape and legitimize these angry, white, right political passions. Nor did the old terms capture the deep nihilism, making values into playthings, truth inconsequential, and the future a matter of indifference, or worse, an unconscious object of destruction. In what follows, I'm going to explore this conjuncture from just one angle. The question I will pose: what generates the anti-political, yet libertarian and authoritarian dimensions of so much popular right-wing reaction today? What novel iterations and expressions of freedom have been wrought from the conjuncture of neoliberal reason, aggrieved white male power, nationalism, and unavowed nihilism? How and why have freedom and illiberalism, freedom and authoritarianism, freedom and legitimized social exclusion and social violence become fused in our time? In the paper, the portion of it that I'm presenting, I'll just make a first foray into this problem by thinking about how neoliberalism set the stage for this phenomenon. Neoliberalism, of course, is commonly understood as a set of economic policies, policies that promote unrestricted actions, flows, and accumulations of capital by means of low tariffs and taxes, deregulated industries, privatized formerly public goods and services, stripped out welfare states, and the breakup of organized labor. Foucault and others have taught us to grasp neoliberalism as more, as a governing rationality, generating distinct kinds of subjects, forms of conduct, and orders of social meaning and value. Different from ideology, which I take to be a distortion or mystification of reality, neoliberal rationality is productive world-making, economizing every sphere in human endeavor and replacing a model of society based on the justice-producing social contract with an order conceived as organized and developed by the spontaneous work of markets and morals, undisturbed by state interference or social engineering. But what's the specific formulation of freedom carried by neoliberal reason? Most obviously, as freedom is submitted to market meanings and the expression of personal morality, it's stripped of the political valences that attach it to popular sovereignty and hence to democracy. Instead, freedom is equated wholly with the pursuit of private ends. It's appropriately unregulated wherever it is, and it's largely exercised to enhance the value or competitive positioning of a person or firm. Its sole political significance is negative, flourishing where politics and government are absent. As neoliberal reason reconfigures freedom's meaning, subjects, and objects, it casts the left as opposing freedom across the board, not just in the economy. And a brief turn to the founding neoliberals allow us to grasp why. Neoliberal thought, of course, was born in the shadows of European fascism and Soviet totalitarianism. Whatever their significant epistemological and ontological differences, various neoliberal thinkers shared the conviction that fascism was on a continuum with the pervasive social planning and state-managed political economies of their time. So Keynesian welfare states, social democracy, public ownership, all appear on what Hayek called the road to serfdom. All represent the related dangers of conceiving nations in terms of society rather than individuals, on the one hand, and all represent the danger of political interference with the spontaneous order of interdependence and need provision generated by individual liberty on the other. But why the attack on society and the social? For neoliberals, as Margaret Thatcher famously intoned, Society simply doesn't exist. There are only individuals and families. Thatcher's intellectual lodestar, Friedrich Hayek, decried the social as a term at once mythical, incoherent, and dangerous, falsely anthropomorphizing and drawing on animism, too. He really hated it. The idea of the social is so nefarious for Hayek because belief in it, and especially belief that we create or design society intentionally and deliberately, inevitably leads to attempts to emplace justice and order by design there. And this, in turn, for Hayek, entails undermining the dynamic order delivered by the combination of markets and morals, neither of which, he says, were ever designed by humans, but rather spontaneously evolve. Now, apart from its role in implementing misguided social policy, why do neoliberals also oppose the realm of the political, especially the state, for anything beyond setting out universal rules for market-ordered societies? For Milton Friedman, the twin threat of politics to freedom rests in its inherent concentration of power. Markets, he thinks, disperse power. It also rests in the fundamental instrument it uses. Politics depends above all on coercion, whether by rule or by dictate, while markets, he insists, always feature choice. Acknowledging that some measure of political power is indispensable for stable, secure societies, and even for the existence and health of markets, for Friedman, every political act, rule, mandate, or decree is a subtraction from individual freedom. Even direct democracy, whenever it falls short of unanimity, compromises freedom as it imposes the will of the majority on the minority. Markets, by contrast, always allow individual preferences to prevail, the equivalent of always getting what one votes for, rather than having to submit to the views of majorities. Hayek, too, regarded political life as compromising individual liberty and the spontaneous order and progress it generates when it's disciplined, hence responsibilized by competition. For Hayek, liberty prevails where there's no intentional human coercion. Liberty is only ever restricted by rules or dictates or threats. He rejects every other meaning of freedom. He's especially hostile to meanings that flirt with capacity or power to act, or meanings that equate freedom with popular sovereignty. All of these other meanings, essential for most Democrats, are not merely wrong, but dangerous insofar as they lead to an enlarged sense of entitlement, thus to state control in the form of resource distribution and social planning. So freedom conceived as agency or capacity or sovereignty will, for Hayek, inevitably produce interventions that limit freedom and destroy spontaneous order. Put sharply, freedom pursued or freedom practiced apart from its liberal market sense, that would be all left emancipation projects. All that kind of freedom inevitably inverts into freedom's opposite. A state indulging in social policy or planning will simultaneously make errors, curtail freedom, stymie innovation and order, reduce discipline, and hence responsibility. So state planning or control is inherently oppressive, error-ridden, and collectively devitalizing. Liberty, by contrast, generates a kind of secular intelligent design when disciplined by the competition that responsibilizes its use. The root principle here, of course, is familiar from Adam Smith, but Hayek has modified it and expanded its purview. As Foucault notes, the modification replaces exchange with competition as the engine of spontaneous order and development, and that means competition has to be installed in every domain and instilled in every subject. The expansion that Hayek engages in from Smith makes market liberty into a comprehensive ontological principle, building an economic theory into a cosmological and normative one. In other words, the same kind of freedom ought to prevail everywhere, and it will produce the same positive effects everywhere. Liberty generates responsibility, responsibility generates discipline, discipline makes social innovations, efficiencies, and order. But how does this normative project take hold? That is, how is neoliberal freedom to be expanded to all domains of existence? And conversely, how is the reach and power of politics confined and reduced? The familiar answer, the one we've been telling ourselves for decades on the left, is that this happens by privatizing public goods and responsibilizing subjects. This was the explicit mission of Thatcherism and Reaganism in the 80s,
do reaganismo.
and all neoliberal governance since. Important as it is, economic privatization only works at one end of the problem that neoliberals aim to solve. It eliminates restrictions on freedom by eliminating government ownership. But more crucial for our purposes today is Hayek's concern with expanding the reach and claim of what he calls the personal protected sphere. Here, fostering individual self-care and even competition are not the driving aims. Rather, this project of freedom, expanding the personal protected sphere, involves designating more and more activity and more claims as private, hence appropriately unregulated and appropriately shielded from democratic norms. In Hayek's words, recognition of property is but the first step in delimiting the private sphere, protecting us against coercion. But, he adds, we mustn't think of this sphere consisting exclusively or even chiefly of material things. Rather, this sphere gives us, and I'm quoting him, protection against interference with our actions. It walls out coercion, especially by that major coercive power, the state, but also coercion exercised by broadly diffused democratic norms such as equality, inclusion, secularism, access, even civility. In other words, more than a project of privatizing public things, here both the zone and the objects of the private are expanded to contest the domain and power of liberty's enemies, coercion exercised through political power and through belief in the social. This form of privatization does more than challenge principles and practices of equality and anti-discrimination by expanding individual rights for persons or even extending them to corporations. Expanding the personal protected sphere is also a means of ushering family values or traditional values, ordinances, and claims into public spaces heretofore organized by democratic law and norms. By this means, the social and the public are not just economized, but familialized, by neoliberalism. Together, this economization and familialization challenge principles of equality, secularism, pluralism, and inclusion at the heart of modern liberal democracies. They allow these principles to be replaced by what Hayek himself termed the traditional moral values securing civilization that emanate from the personal protected sphere. Consider in this regard the U.S. campaign to replace public funding of education with systems of individual vouchers that permit families to choose schools for their children that comport closely with their moral values and to avoid schools that do not. Or consider court rulings in the U.S. permitting businesses to escape federal equality mandates on the basis of religious belief, that is, refusal to serve LGBT customers or Muslims. Or consider the increasingly open identification of Western nations with Christianity in not just conservative but centrist political discourse, and consider the compromise of a secular public sphere that this identification with Christianity entails. Or consider the forthrightness with which traditional morality or family values are featured centrally in all extreme right platforms aimed at recapturing the nation from liberals, from secularists, or from Muslims, or from multiculturalists. In short, expanding the so-called personal protected sphere and curtailing the reach of democracy in the name of freedom develops a new ethos of the nation, one that replaces a public, pluralistic, secular, democratic national imaginary with a private, homogeneous, familial one. The former features commitments to modest openness, rule of law, cultural and religious pluralism. The latter, the new national imaginary, is walled, exclusionary, homogeneous, unified, hierarchical, and potentially authoritarian. Neoliberal economic privatization, that more familiar form of privatization, is deeply subversive of democracy. It generates inequality, exclusion, private ownership of the commons, plutocracy, and a profoundly dimmed democratic imaginary. But this second order of privatization that I've been considering subverts democracy with anti-democratic moral or family values rather than anti-democratic capital values. It wages familial rather than market warfare on democratic principles and institutions, as it positions exclusion, patriarchalism, tradition, nepotism, and Christianity as legitimate market democratic challenges to inclusion, autonomy, equal rights, limits on conflict of interest, and the very principle of equality. Moreover, while both kinds of privatization are animated by a concern with freedom, it's this second one that is especially important in generating the political formation of what we might call authoritarian freedom today, as the personal protected sphere is empowered against a common society and expands to envelop the nation itself. Securing and protecting that sphere requires and legitimates increasingly robust statism in the form of law, policing, and defense. Rights attached to individuals are the flying wedge with which democratic commitments to equality, civility, and inclusion are being challenged by neoliberal reason. But the force behind these rights, which stages incursion into public space and pushes back against the political and the democratic, are, I'm suggesting, the claims of the market on the one hand and heteropatriarchal Christian familialism on the other. In each case, rights are strategically redeployed from their liberal democratic intended attachment to individuals to something else, whether corporations or property or capital or families or churches or whiteness. Economic and familial privatization of the public, combined with a neoliberal denigration of the social, together build the right-wing attack on what it calls social justice or social justice warriors, and builds that attack as something that it is able to then call fascist or tyrannical. Redress of historical injustices, even basic civil rights for racial and sexual minorities, women, other subordinate groups, these become rendered by neoliberal rationality as contrived, illegitimate dictates that draw on what Hayek termed the mirage of the social and constitute, in the right's view, attacks both on personal freedom and interference in the spontaneous order of markets and morals. The charge then, by the right, is not just that these social justice projects or basic provisions of equality and inclusion serve egalitarian rather than libertarian ends. That's a cardinal sin in any neoliberal playbook. The charge is not just that they impose a political vision of the good society, social engineering or planning, where there should only be liberty, competition, and privatism. It's not just that they're political interventions, regulatory or redistributive, where achievement and reward should be achieved by markets. It's not just that they suppress the creative energies of free individuals and the spontaneous order these energies yield. And it's not just that they contravene traditional morality or limit the entitlement of families and churches to influence civic life in neighborhoods, towns, and nations. Rather, all of these wrongs are sculpted together into a figure of the political Antichrist within a Hayekian formulation of freedom that valorizes and expands the private to push back the reach of the political and challenge the very existence of the social. Extending the purview of the private and extending the disintegrative force of deregulation to everything, everywhere, enables a novel practice of freedom to quite literally materialize the claim there is no such thing as society, as it assaults the values and practices that sustain social bonds, social inclusion, social cooperation, social provision, and of course, social equality. At this point, it's easy to see how sometimes viciously sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and racist speech and conduct have today erupted as expressions of freedom, challenging the dictates of what the right terms simply our political correctness. That is, our view that there should be social coercion backed by the state. When the protected personal sphere, as Hayek called it, is empowered and extended, when opposition to restriction and regulation becomes a foundational, universal principle, when the social is demeaned and the political is demonized, individual animus and the historical powers of white male dominance gain new form as well as legitimacy. No one owes anything to anyone. No one has the right to restrict anything in anyone, and equality, as Hayek bluntly declared, is the language simply of envy. Meanwhile, left opposition to supremacist sentiment is tyrannical policing, rooted in the totalitarian mythos of the social and drawing on the coercive powers of the political. I want to be very clear here. I'm not claiming that Hayek or other neoliberals imagined or advocated for the strikingly disinhibited attacks today on immigrants, Muslims, blacks, Jews, queers, feminists, and women from an emboldened and growing radical right today. My point, rather, is that these developments are in part effects of neoliberal reason. Its expansion of the domain and claim of the private and the moral for persons and corporations alike, and its rejection of political and social as opposed to market lexicons for justice. Moreover, the displacement of the social and the attack on the political, along with the broad discrediting of democratic norms, fueled and legitimated energies that have come from an entirely different set of concrete neoliberal effects, namely the declining sovereignty of men, of whites, of Christianity, and nation states. These energies of aggrieved power are variously expressed, rancorous public aggression in some cases, but also quiet voting for far-right candidates. And these energies of aggrieved power target a range of objects: politicians, liberal elites, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, queers, blacks, and others. But they wouldn't have a legitimate political form in a liberal or social democratic order, and that's why they remained on the political fringe for so long. Neoliberal reason's assault on egalitarianism, on social provision, justice, politics, and democracy, its extension of the personal protected sphere, has given them that legitimate form. So we're dealing with what Stuart Hall would call a conjuncture, or what Foucault would term a contingent genealogical formation. I will conclude by suggesting that we're now positioned to comprehend one of the more perplexing features of our current landscape, namely how the right, especially the extreme right, can both be the party of freedom and nationalism, freedom and protectionism, maximized personal liberty and traditional social values, when the twin dimensions of privatization we've been considering capture the nation itself. The nation ceases to be figured primarily as a democracy where the people rule through modest political equality. Instead, it's figured as a competitive business, needing to make good deals and attract investors on the one hand, and as an inadequately secured home, besieged by ill-willed or non-belonging outsiders on the other. Contemporary right-wing nationalism oscillates between or combines the two. Consider Trump's continuous braying about America's history of bad deals on everything from trade to NATO to climate accords, but also his depiction of the U.S. as savaged by its unsecured borders, and his promise to build a wall featuring what he called a great big beautiful door through which legal entrants from the South may visit or join what he termed our family. Or consider Marine Le Pen's France for the French campaign, which also combined economic and familial languages to depict the nation. We are the owners of our country, she declared at rally after rally in eastern France. We must have the keys to open the House of France, open it halfway, or close the door. It's our house, the crowd chanted back. Or, as one supporter explained, she's not against immigrants, only securing justice. It's like when the refrigerator is full. We give to our neighbors, but when it's empty, we only give to our children. The refrigerator of France is empty. Or consider the Alternative for Germany platform, which combines economic nationalism and withdrawal from the euro with these slogans, quote, "It's about us, our culture, our home, our Germany." Or the slogan, "Islam does not fit our kitchen." In each case, justice is expressed as a combination of business principles and the titrated hospitality of a private household. Democracy is nowhere to be found. Indeed, when the nation is economized and familiarized in this way, democratic principles of universality, equality, and openness become vulnerable. The nation becomes legitimately illiberal toward those designated as aversive insiders and invading outsiders. Statism, policing, and authoritarian power ramify because walling, policing, and securitization of every kind are authorized by the need to secure this vast expanse of personal, deregulated freedom. More than guaranteeing or limiting freedom, walls, gates, security systems, no trespassing signs become freedom's fundamental signifiers. Why? They demarcate the private from the public, the protected from the owned or open, the familiar from the strange, the owned from the common. Democratic procedure and legitimacy are displaced by the values of the family on the one hand and the market on the other. Securing a vast expanse of the private and of deregulated freedom thus inaugurates new spaces and new valorizations of policing, authority, and securitization, the need for which is intensified by the frustration and the rancor generated by neoliberal deracinations and precarity. Et voilà, 21st century authoritarianism in freedom's name. Thank you.
Well, hello to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Sesc Pompeia for opening us this beautiful place, and especially the organizers, Judith, Brianna, Natalia, and Vladimir, for having the generosity of inviting me. I can tell you I'm very honored and pleased to be here with you. Well, my paper is called Resilient Soberanities, a new onto-political fiction of life and identity. In the preface to Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, Judith Butler distinguishes between two different kinds of possible political and ethical responses to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. On the one hand, she describes the US response to aggression, an attempt to recover the fantasy of invulnerable sovereignty by retaliating in a violent way. On the other hand, Butler claims that such a traumatic experience, instead of reinforcing an immunizing response, could have led to a critical analysis of the limits of sovereignty. She argues that the terrorist attacks and the injury they caused made it clear that our lives depend on people whom we don't know even exist, showing a radical human interdependency. Instead of making borders more invulnerable to external attacks, this second kind of ethico-political response to the interruption of sovereignty would have involved recognizing vulnerability as a common condition shared by all human beings. Doing so would have enabled a new kind of collectivity, one no longer based on sovereignty, but on the precariousness of human existence. This paper draws on a third kind of response to violence, one also directly linked with the American 9/11. As different authors have shown, since the 90s, but especially since the attacks of September 11, 2001, the concept of resilience has pervaded risk management rationalities. Today, resilience is the, I quote, top priority for the sustainable development, key to international security concerns, from cyber conflict to the war on terror, and vital for disaster risk reduction, conflict prevention, climate change, and social, economic, and institutional development. End of quote. Some examples of the contemporary cultural spreading of the concept of resilience include, for example, if one searches for resilience in the website of the International Monetary Fund, the search reveals that almost 2,000 documents contain a reference to the term. Another example, the US Army has designed a training program called Ready and Resilient. Finally, in my country, the Universidad de Chile has recently opened a major research center for climate science and resilience, and the main campaign slogan of a current presidential candidate is, I quote, resilient nation. Just a few examples. However, the concept of resilience is not new. Etymologically, it comes from the Latin resilience, which means to rebound, recoil. And the first modern use of this term is found in the 19th century when engineers used it to describe the elastic capacity of a material to recover from deformation and regain its original shape. But it was during the second half of the 20th century when researchers in two different fields, psychology and ecology, began to give to this concept its contemporary meaning. In general, we can say that today the notion of resilience has broadened its sense, since it not only expresses the capacity to recover from an unexpected accident, but also, I quote, the capacity of an entity or system to withstand shocks, recover, adapt, or in some cases learn, evolve, or move to a new systemic equilibrium while maintaining basic functions. End of quote. That is, the contemporary notion of resilience does not refer so much to the idea of being simply preserved beyond traumatic change, but to the capacity to grow and develop through trauma. For example, according to Martin Seligman, enhancing soldiers' resilience would not only help prevent post-traumatic stress disorder, it will also, I quote, increase the number of soldiers who would grow psychologically from the crucible of combat, end of quote. So resilience has become a new rationality that has pervaded many different discourses. These propose new strategies for governing ourselves and others in the face of uncertain futures. As Foucault and others have pointed out, one of the main characteristics of liberal technologies of governmentality is to situate individuals within complex juridical, political, and economic contexts which produce uncertain futures and make them personally responsible for them, having to permanently choose between freedom and security. In fact, Foucault explicitly says that liberalism, psychological and cultural correlatives are fear and danger. He writes, I quote Foucault, "The motto of liberalism is live dangerously. That is to say, individuals are constantly exposed to danger, or rather, they are conditioned to experience their situation, their life, their present, and their future as containing danger. In short," continues Foucault, "everywhere you see this stimulation of the fear of danger, which is, as it were, the condition, the internal psychological and cultural correlative of liberalism. There is no liberalism without a culture of danger." End of quote. One might conclude on the basis of claims like this that resilience is nothing but another neoliberal technology of government. Nevertheless, I would like to show that this is a reductive claim which fails to fully understand the specificity of the concept of resilience. So, in what follows, instead of emphasizing continuities, I would like to analyze how resilience problematizes and introduces some discontinuities into neoliberal governmentality. The first discontinuity that I will analyze relates to different ways of imagining the future. As François Eval has shown, if we analyze the rationalities of risk management from the 19th century to the 21st century, although it is possible to identify significant differences, there is one common factor. All of them suppose that risks are calculable and that, therefore, people should have a prudent attitude toward future. But, as we will see, the homo prudence has little to do with the homo resilience. And the main reason for this is that resilience does not cope with calculable risk, but with unimaginable futures. In other words, resilience seeks to produce a subjective perspective that is prepared to face everything, even, and in fact especially, unimaginable horrors. In this sense, resilience is not a strategy for avoiding risk, but a way of living with and through uncertainty. If the resilience boom came after the American 9/11, this is precisely because that situation confronted us with something beyond our imagination. And as long as resilience assumes the impossibility of anticipating and avoiding future disasters, then it is not a defensive strategy, but a post-apocalyptic one, which assumes that we will have to learn to live and even thrive with and through such disasters. So the second discontinuity between neoliberal governmentality and resilience has to do with the role of fear. We have seen that for Foucault, fear was a crucial affect for understanding liberal and neoliberal governmentality. But it seems that this is no longer true for resilience. In a 2008 article called "America the Resilient," Stephen Flynn analyzes the US response to the events of the 9/11 as follows, I quote, "Building the resilience of American society would increase the nation's security by depriving Al-Qaeda and other terrorists of the fear dividend they hope to reap. Whereas increasing security measures is an inevitable answer to a society's fears, resilience rests on a foundation of confidence and optimism. It involves taking stock of what is truly precious and ensuring its durability in a way that would allow Americans to remain true to their ideals, no matter what tempest the future may bring. End of quote. These words indicate the specificity of resilient response to injury. Flynn distinguishes between what he identifies as the security measures, which are the political actions enabled by fear, and resilience, which is a fearless, confident, and optimistic mode of response. As we know, at least since Hobbes, fear has been a key affect for liberal rationalities of government. I would like to analyze just one aspect of this long history, which is the role that it has played in the articulation of liberal governmentality with sovereign rationality. Let us recall that for Foucault, the main objective of sovereign power was to protect and fortify the integrity of a certain territory. And to do so, the sovereign had the right to kill. In his 1975-1976 lectures published under the title Society Must Be Defended, Foucault introduces the concept of biopower to explain the limits of sovereign power. If sovereign power was the juridical right to kill and let live, biopower is the power to make live and let die. It is important to notice that sovereign power was legitimized by the legal order, whereas biopower is legitimized by administrative norms and liberal forms of governmentality. However, Foucault encounters many problems when he thinks about the possible articulations between biopower and sovereignty. For example, in his 14th January 1976 lecture, he affirms that they are absolutely incompatible. But only 2 months later, he will relate them using the concept of racism. Foucault explicitly addressed the problems of thinking biopower and sovereignty together in the following terms. I quote Foucault. How will the power to kill and the function of murder operate in these technologies of power, which takes life as both its object and its objective? How can power such as this kill if it is true that its basic function is to improve life, to prolong its duration, to improve its chances, to avoid accidents, and to compensate for failings? How, under these conditions, is it possible for a political power to kill, to call for deaths, to demand deaths, to give the order to kill, and to expose not only its enemies, but its own citizens to the risk of death? End of quote. The answer that Foucault gives to these questions is that racism allows us to articulate these two kinds of powers in the following way. If you want to live, then you must take lives. You must be able to kill. So, racism brought together the old sovereign right to kill with biopower by legitimizing violence against certain lives in order to protect other lives. This paradoxical relationship, which implies that it's necessary to administer small doses of death to protect and inoculate life, is identified by Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito as the paradigm of immunization. For Esposito, this paradigm shows that in liberal rationality, the relationship between the power to make live and the right to kill is not accidental but immanent. And in this articulation, fear plays a key role. Going back to Hobbes, Esposito says that the modern state's task is not to eradicate fear, but to render it certain, to prolong it and even make it the motor of and guarantee of the state's proper functioning, so that it can operate as the affective hinge between the power to make live and the right to kill. Because we are afraid of being killed, we justify killing. Because we fear losing our civil rights, we justify their partial suspension, and so on. So, the resignification of vulnerability as a common ground for new collective identifications, as proposed by Butler, could be understood as a critical approach to this paradoxical and cruel bond between biopower and sovereignty. In other words, if injury interrupts or calls into question the sovereign's pride, can we imagine a response that would not be a retaliation caused by fear? Is it possible that the interruption of sovereignty, instead of reinforcing the fantasy of invulnerability and perpetuating the death-dealing response, would be experienced as a radical limit of sovereignty as such? My hypothesis is that, in a certain way, with different results and purposes, the pervasive emergence of the resilient response to injury represents another way to address the same questions about the limits of the paradigm of immunization in our contemporary liberal democracies. But how could resilience stop the fearful response to injury? If, as Posito says, the task of liberal democracies is not to end fear, but to render it certain, that is, calculable, anticipable, and manageable, then why or how could the acceptance that it is impossible to do calculate, anticipate, and manage fear produce anything other than a panicked response? How could this acceptance even produce an optimistic and confident one? What does resilience trust? To try to answer to these questions, I will introduce a third discontinuity between liberal and neoliberal risk management on the one hand, and resilience on the other. If classical risk management strategies were organized by a central intelligence, whether the state or the ego of the Homo prudens, the resilient response to danger totally lacks any such system of the system. This shift implies, first, that any intelligence that seeks to enhance resilience must accept its inability to intentionally shape the future. And second, it implies that Homo resilience cannot trust that any central intelligence would, in the future, have the capacity to organize the right response when confronted with unexpected threats. Instead of relying on central intelligence, then the Homo resilient must trust on the immanent, spontaneous, emergent response produced by complex interactions among the different systems in which human life is embedded. Socio-ecological system, communicational systems, system of goods exchange, and so on. Thus, Philippa Lentzos and Nicholas Rose write, I quote, "Resilience implies a systematic, widespread organizational, structural, and personal strengthening of subjective and material arrangement so as to be better able to anticipate and tolerate disturbances in complex worlds without collapse, to withstand shocks, and to rebuild as necessary. Perhaps the opposite of the big brother state, a logic of resilience would aspire to create a subjective and systematic state to enable each and all to live freely and with confidence in a world of potential risk." End of quote. Being fundamentally a headless strategy to face dangers, resilience can be considered as a critique of human agency. This shift would constitute an immanent critique for David Chandler, this shift would constitute an immanent critique of neoliberalism, that is, a use of neoliberalism against itself. Following Foucault, Chandler shows that one main characteristic of all liberal forms of governance is that they presuppose and value positively their own limits. In other words, according to Foucault, for liberal governmentalities, the main question is how not to govern too much. How not to govern too much, that's it. In this sense, Foucault says the free market was the boundary and at the same time the place where all liberal forms of governmentality could grasp of their own truth. Foucault says this side of truth of liberal forms of governmentality is not in the heads of economists, of course, but is the market, says Foucault. The market was thus the epistemological outer limit of liberal rationalities, and at the same time, the only access that they had to the unknowable complexity of life. So Chandler continues, I quote David Chandler, what is distinct about resilience is that complex life is no longer seen merely constituting the limit to the world of governmental reason, but instantiates the unknowns as the basis of governmental reason itself. In other words, if liberal rationalities try to govern over life, resilience is a tragedy that governs through life, says Chandler. Thus, what resilience seems to overcome is an internal tension in liberal rationalities, a tension between the need to govern ourselves and others, on the one hand, and on the other, the epistemological limit that any intentional intelligence agency must consider. This shift implies two movements. In the first place, resilience radicalizes the limits of any possible intentional agency. Traditional liberal rationalities suppose that even if the agent couldn't have access to life's complexity, the market, through price variations, knew something about it. So Chandler says that this could be considered an epistemological limit. But from the point of view of resilience, life's complexity produces a desubstantialized ontology, introducing immanent, unimaginable possibilities and alternative ways of being and becoming into the present. The future is no longer imaginable then, even for the market, because from resilience perspective, life's complexity implies the ontological possibility of changing the normative parameters that, in the present, seem to be unavoidable conditions of possibility of reality. That is why, says Chandler's, resilience critique of agency is not epistemological, but ontological. The second movement to consider in this passage from traditional liberal rationalities to resilience is the resignification of this ontological limit. If life's complexity is irreducible, making it impossible to predict what is going to happen in the interaction between an agent and a system, then at the same time, this ungraspable surplus opens the possibility for the emergence of new and unexpected forms of life. So resilience no longer seeks to protect certain kinds of life to the detriment of others. Instead, in Canguilhem's terms, it seems to trust in the capacity of life to create new normative parameters and therefore other unconceivable kinds of lives. Therefore, the resilient agent, even if she does not know whether she's going to be preserved in her current delimited body existent, must rely on the headless, nomadic, creative ontology of life, which has the power to thrive on even the worst events in unpredictable ways. So, going back to some of the questions that I raised before, it seems, I say it seems because after I'm going to show the limits of this assumption, that resilience does not trust in any kind of classical sovereign response to aggression and injury. In the first place, because there is no longer a juridical agent who can be situated outside biopower to decide who must die. From the resilient perspective, even though, for example, a government decides to go to war and destroy its enemy, this decision must be considered as an internal change of the headless system, which will create unknown possibilities and new reconfigurations of life. In addition, something similar happens to the notion of injury. When injury becomes merely another possibility or instance of life-affirming creativity, it cannot be considered the result of an act of aggression. This notion of injury makes sense only when there is a delimited body whose existence depends on the conservation of certain borders or parameters that the act of aggression endangers. But if there is no longer a body to protect, but just a headless nomadic life that thrives, then injury no longer makes sense. So there is no way of distinguishing an injury from an opportunity. And it is impossible to know if trying to destroy our enemies will create new conditions where they are going to be stronger or weaker. Sovereign rationality as a whole, therefore, becomes senseless, and so does its articulation with biopower through fear. Nevertheless, there is a fourth and last characteristic of resilient rationality that I would like to analyze. In fact, we cannot forget that resilience is also supposed to preserve something. Going back to the inaugural 1973 paper by C.S. Holling called Resilience and Stability of Ecological Systems, we can trace the paradoxical relationship established by resilience between change and conservation. For Holling, the stability of a system, which is its ability to return to equilibrium after a disturbance, must be distinguished from resilience, which is the ability of a system to absorb changes and still persist. Consequently, Holling says a system which is not exposed to dramatic changes is stable but not resilient, while, on the contrary, a system that is permanently exposed to change is resilient but not stable. Therefore, we arrive at a counterintuitive definition, which is that resilience, I quote, embraces change as a requisite to persist. End of quote. But what is this thing that still persists after change? What is this thing that affirms its identity through change? What is resilience protecting, and from what? These are not easy questions to answer. At least we know that resilience does not directly seek to protect human lives, but rather life in a broader sense. The complexity of life, as seen from the standpoint of resilience, implies overcoming some classical distinctions. For example, contemporary discourses on resilience no longer consider human action as artificial and external to natural ecological systems. Rather, these discourses understand socio-ecological systems functioning as a whole. At the same time, when it comes to the distinction between living and non-living things, the perspective of resilience tends to erase traditional boundaries. For example, regarding homeland security, resilience has been used to think about the resistance to unexpected dramatic events of critical infrastructure, that is, the framework of physical structures and cyber information networks that provides a continual flow of information, goods, and services essential to the defense and economic security. In this context, resilience implies reliance on the capacity of those physical systems to spring back to life and survive catastrophic damage without human interference. It is as if the object of critical infrastructure take on a life on their own. So, what any intelligent agent that seeks to enhance resilience can and must do is to fortify the interconnectedness of possible exchanges among those complex systems. As Lentzos and Rose, again, have shown, resilience is a strategy, I quote, for reconciling liberty and security without destroying the intensified and extended mobility, flow, and circulation of persons and things on which contemporary freedom is seen to depend. End of quote. As long as unexpected events do not interfere the interconnected of those various systems, resilience guarantees that life can get a surplus value out of any disaster. Rose and Lentzos have just published a second paper on resilience. There they say that resilient responses should be considered as post-social strategies for governing because the imagined territory on which they act is not that of society but of community. And they conclude, even though resilience may be conservative in its implications, aiming to retain or recreate what is threatened rather than transform it, perhaps it might provide handholds for a more progressive politics, end of quote. But if resilience is a governmental strategy that is supposed to be open to unknown possibilities, how can we delimit its territory? Does resilience govern over an imagined, as Rose and Lentzos says, does resilience govern over an imagined territory or through the unexpected creativity of life? What kind of boundaries could contain the alleged openness of resilience? But is it not true that this concept implies a paradoxical relationship between change, openness, vulnerability on the one hand, and protection, invulnerability, survival on the other hand? This contradiction takes place each time that resilience is linked with a specific subject, soldiers' resilience, national resilience, and so on. How is it possible that resilience, which is supposed to be absolutely blind to the results of its strategy, could be used a priori as a defensive method meant to protect and consolidate through change and contingency certain transcendental identities? Couldn't we ask, in our effort to think resilience, the same type of questions that Foucault raised to problematize the relationship between biopower and sovereignty? In other words, how is it possible that resilience could involve both a radical, non-normative openness to the possibilities of unprecedented lives and the preservation of certain lives to the detriment of others? When Foucault analyzes the boundaries over which the sovereign reigns, he quotes Kantarowicz's famous book, The King's Two Bodies. There, Kantarowic shows that for medieval political theology, the king had one material, perishable body that was born and died, and another body that remained unchanged through time and was maintained as the physical yet intangible support of the kingdom. Regarding resilience, it seems that the concept of life likewise has a dual function. Sometimes life is considered at the molecular level as the anti-normative possibility of perpetual transformation, while at other times life is considered at the molar level where it re-encounters the metaphysics of territory and the sovereign spiritual body, understood as the immaterial specter of life that emerges from a set of complex relationships that must be preserved. This means that the identity of the sovereign's body does not depend on any static symbols, but on the persistence of the capacity to adapt and thrive through change. Even though the Leviathan has been beheaded, its metaphysical body still lives, and with it, the ability to protect its fluidity from everything that threatens to stop it. In the US National Strategy for Homeland Security, we read, I quote, "Ultimately, response, recovery, and rebuilding efforts are tightly intertwined, each tapping into the resilience of the American spirit and our determination to endure and become stronger in the face of adversity." How should we understand the intertwining of resilience and a nation's determination to endure and become stronger? The key mediating concept that sustains what seems to be a paradoxical relationship is the American spirit. Understood as the metaphysical body of a set of complex, flexible interrelations between human and non-human things, the American spirit privatizes and capitalizes on the thriving of life as such to the detriment of other possible bodies. Therefore, although I have emphasized the discontinuities between liberal and resilient rationalities of government, we have to concede that resilience in some ways remains continuous with the paradigm of immunization. While injury and war may have different meanings, they are still human, national, ecological, and other bodies to destroy and protect, and we still have good reasons to fear losing the integrity of these bodies, and maybe, just maybe, we or Donald Trump will have to build some tall, strong walls to preserve them. Thank you.
So I too want to thank the organizers. Actually, I've been thrilled and honored by this invitation from the very beginning, and thankful for the wonderful organization, which was a challenge and a lot of effort for everyone involved. But this is almost always the case. Today it's a bit different. I'm really, really impressed by this thoughtfulness with which our organizers have managed to protect this conference from these ugly and insulting interferences that we had a glimpse of this morning. And I think it's actually a wonder how we managed to have this focused and thoughtful conference and discussion nevertheless. So both of the papers are wonderful and insightful papers, and both of them, as I understand them, are fruitful attempts to understand our current situation. While we might be only at the beginning of understanding our times, developing conceptual tools in various ways, Rodrigo and Wendy have certainly already done a big step forward. So since these papers are so different in their approach, I'm going to comment separately on them and just want to raise a couple of questions with respect to both in order to open up the discussion. Actually, I was not prepared for the move that Wendy's new paper took when she asks how comes that democracy nowadays can be identified with communism, and that we are seen as a bunch of communists, even if some of us only wanted to discuss the end and the ends of democracy. So I would say just a short improvised comment on her comments on communism and democracy. Maybe these people are right. Maybe in a free variation of a famous remark by Marx, who famously said that democracy is the resolved puzzle of all constitutions. Maybe communism is the resolved puzzle of democracy. And the other way around, those who want to prevent communism, and communism for them is already having something like health insurance, obviously. So those who want to prevent communism as the material counterpart of a democratic organization of society, once we see that the tension between capitalism and democracy is not contingent but structural, maybe those turn out to become anti-democrats, at least if necessary. This is, I guess, not so far from the answer that Wendy gives in her paper when she spells out the rationality of neoliberalism and its connection to authoritarianism and brings this to our attention. So in trying to understand our times, Wendy's paper can be seen as yet another answer to a general question that has been widely discussed. A question that has enormous consequences for our future and the political options of the left. The question is this, the rise of populist authoritarian movements, the end of neoliberalism, or is it its continuation? Here we are faced with two opposing interpretations, namely the end or the continuation. In short, the question here is whether neoliberalism is continuous or discontinuous with authoritarianism and populism, and if so, in which respect? The puzzling phenomena that Wendy addresses is the obvious affinity between neoliberalism and authoritarianism. The fact that the movements and political tendencies we want to understand seem to be both authoritarian and neoliberal. But then neoliberalism and right-wing authoritarianism not only go together or get along with each other, as however strange bedfellows, but are continuous with each other based on the same logic of privatization, as Wendy argues, and a restricted idea of negative freedom, both leading to the abolishment of democracy or even a hatred of politics. This is, as Wendy convincingly calls it, authoritarianism in freedom's name. Neoliberalism then not only produces Trumpism as some kind of red reaction, they are the results of the same logic. That is, Wendy makes a powerful argument for the continuation thesis, even if we will have to discuss how far she wants to go here. So my first question is related to the dynamics involved. Besides of the elective affinities and the continuity between neoliberalism and authoritarianism that she has spelled out, we can't deny that something has changed as well during the last couple of years, and with all the local differences all over the world. If it is still within the logic of neoliberalism, it is certainly a new phase of neoliberalism, even if it might be neoliberalism's Frankenstein. Authoritarian and classical neoliberalism, as we might call it, might then be seen as different stages or phases developing out of the same systemic structure and reacting to tensions and contradictions within it that historically evolve. Politically and historically, we then need to elaborate and try to understand and distinguish these different stages. Historically spoken, there must be something within the dynamics of neoliberalism that has brought about the authoritarian moment or has led to a new phase of neoliberalism. And I wonder what this dynamic comes to, what has triggered the dynamics, and whether we could and should speak of a crisis within the classic stage of neoliberalism that has led to the current authoritarian one. It's my first question to Wendy, how she would conceive of this historical the dynamics or the tensions that might underlie these dynamics. My second question challenged the continuation thesis from another angle. Let me first spell out why the thesis that neoliberalism and authoritarianism go together is so special and the connection so unusual, therefore why Wendy holds a provocative thesis that doesn't go without saying. A conventional understanding of both authoritarianism and neoliberalism would certainly detect a tension rather than an affinity between the two of them. Authoritarianism, after all, and according to this common understanding, might be connected with traditionalism, paternalism, the idea of homogeneous nation, social and economical protectionism, and a value-oriented attitude in politics, even sometimes a community-oriented, if exclusionary tendency. In contrast to this, neoliberalism is sometimes conceived of in terms of a market-oriented negative liberty, and with this coming a dynamics in which, again, quoting Marx, everything that is stable dissolves into the air. That is some kind of modernism, anti-traditionalism, going along with globalization and even some kind of cosmopolitanism sometimes. Up to the point that one can see elective affinities, not with neoliberalism and authoritarianism, but the elective affinities that Nancy Fraser has called progressive neoliberalism, meaning that neoliberalism is able to buy into, promote, or, the kind of at least unintended side effects that go along with neoliberalism, according to this thesis, that are somehow progressive. So how then can it be both? How can neoliberalism, or how can these movements be authoritarian and neoliberal at the same time? Wendy's answer is powerful. It all resists on the idea that the idea of negative liberty that neoliberalism promotes is linked with privatization, not only in the real, not only in the realm of economy, but in every sphere of the social. It is, as she powerfully argues, familiarized. This also means preventing the state from promoting affirmative action, for example, in effect goes along with some kind of anti-emancipatory re-traditionalization along traditional family lines and all its consequences. It means going back to a certain kind of family orientation. To keep the state out of education and out of the working place then means to stick with naturalized traditional forms and values. There we have the connection between neoliberalism and value orientation, the disconnection that I cited would not go for. So not only within the family, but with respect to the values that run the public life, that in neoliberalism is never openly admitted to be public, they have public consequences. Political correctness from this perspective is an attempt to artificially transform what should be up to us, and up to us then means not to change how things have traditionally evolved. The privatization of the good then, the fact that important aspects of how we live our unavoidably collective life then doesn't lead to cultural liberalization and plurality, but to re-traditionalization and to the persistence of anti-emancipatory impulses. So this is a really interesting and thought-provoking thesis that certainly captures a lot. But let me express some doubts as well. Hasn't the privatization of the good that Wendy refers to led to both re-traditionalization and conformism, no longer threatened by emancipatory movements and ideas, but without doubt it also has led to pluralism of sorts. After all, we have had what might be referred to as cultural liberalization within neoliberalism. Part of what is lost now is the even if unintended consequence of the very same cultural and economical social process. So maybe Wendy, in her attempt to work out the continuity, underestimates the inherent tensions between authoritarianism and neoliberalism in this respect. So my take would be that it is actually the absence of an emancipatory discourse and the identification with subjective rights that are meritocratic and individualistic in character, and in general the absence of a critique of forms of life that refers to more than thin liberal standards that has led to this re-traditionalization. But then this is not only about neoliberalism, but also about political liberalism, with its tendency towards a negative concept of liberty and what Geuss calls the myth of anti-paternalism, which has contributed to this privatization of the good. And then to get out of there is not so easy. It is a crisis of liberalism, and liberalism of both sorts, neoliberalism and political liberalism, that we are facing. And to come up with emancipatory standards of critique is not as easy as it might seem. Actually, I love Wendy's remark when she said that even those of us who didn't, who pretended not to believe in progress, have found out that they did. But this, huh? That was for me, I know. No, I mean, thank you so much. Thank you. So, found out that they did. But this also means that it's our duty now to spell out these, taken for granted progressive moments in these emancipatory moments that we just thought would be granted, and that we thought that we wouldn't have to establish a certain kind of normative framework in order to call for them. So this means overcoming the idea of negative liberty and the ideological and atomist assumption of independence that so much of liberal as well as neoliberal thought and practice is based upon, which also means going back to taking progress for granted, giving substantial content to the idea of emancipation and defend it on normative grounds, which might also mean defending communism or socialism or whatever, however you want to call it, and not only liberal rights and progress in terms of liberal rights. Which leads to my third question, the normative question. Here I'm taking my clue from two rather random and innocent remarks in Wendy's paper. I mean, the first remark is that she holds that this is neoliberal subjectivation is something else, is not ideological, is not an ideology because it is productive. And the second remark is when she says that it is the affinity between liberalism and its outcome is a contingent genealogical formation. So talking about how to normatively establish a framework for a powerful concept of emancipation here, I would suggest that it's exactly ideology critique that we might be engaged in. And I mean, the first remark, of course, would be that depending on how we conceive of ideology, the neoliberal focus on negative liberty is certainly an ideology, as I would call it. It's not just some distorted view of reality, but a set of powerful institutions and practices. And this is what ideologies actually are, not an error, but productive. As such, it is not a contingent genealogical formation, but constitutive for what neoliberal capitalism is and has been from the very beginning. It is systematically interwoven with the practices and institutions in questions, and actually it somehow has brought them about. Look at freedom, for example, as an ideology within the classical capitalist labor market, an ideology that has taken a different shape in neoliberalism by its being connected with a certain idea of independence, of creativity, of being responsible, but it's still basically the same kind of ideology, I would say. And freedom in this classical setting has been both true and false. It's certainly constitutive, since there would be no free labor market and no labor free to be exploited without the assumption that individuals are free to enter a contract. The same holds for the more general idea of independency that drives the neoliberal world. This is the basis contradiction that liberalism and capitalism have been working with from the very beginning. Putting into question, denying the fact of the social that Wendy has referred to as well, the idea that neoliberalism denies that such a thing as society even exists. So denying the fact of the social, that human beings are already associated and can only get a certain kind of independence by working through this dependency, by shaping the various dependencies that shape their lives. This kind of denying of the social is not just some random strategy, but I would say the kernel of bourgeois society that we can conceive of as an association of those who deny their being associated. Again, a Marx quotation. So this is not only about how to use and understand the concept of ideology, it is also about our prospects for and strategies for critique. We can then criticize the assumption of independency as ideology, that is, as a practically productive delusion and distortion inherent in the liberal form of life as it is constituted through this self-understanding and kept in place through the kind of legitimation or the legitimizing narrative that is connected with negative liberty and this illusion of independence. So much for Wendy. Now I turn to Rodrigo's wonderful exploration. Okay, slower. I try my best. So let's turn to Rodrigo's wonderful exploration of the concept of resilience. Actually, this is beautiful, thorough, and a deep analysis of this concept and the idea of resilience, and I learned a lot about its different dimensions. I'm convinced by his attempt to draw out the difference between resilience and the modes of sovereignty based on fear that rule the neoliberal world. Instead of seeing it as yet another neoliberal technology of government, he conceives of it as something specific, discontinuous with neoliberal strategies. But in addition to this, he also seeks for a productive potential in the concept of resilience. He asks, how could resilience offer a way out of the old liberal trap? So what is he looking for and why? I think there are two alternatives that he wants to give us a third way in between. It's an alternative between precariousness and sovereignty, something that allows us to act but not in terms of sovereignty. And it's also what he calls a way out of a fear-driven Hobbesianism that might lead to potentials for liberation. It is here about the productive potential in the concept of resilience that I'm not convinced. So why would one turn to resilience? I'm not sure, and that is actually a question to Rodrigo in terms of a question of clarification. I'm not sure about the status of that resilience here has. Is it just a fact of life, or is it something we should strive for? Should we set our hopes in it in the mode of a Heideggerian Gelassenheit, or should we take it into account that when you think about what is to be done? Now, as a fact of life, there is no doubt that resilience exists. Human beings sometimes survive the most damaging conditions. Those who have been working on trauma and traumatization know about the small and hidden resources that people sometimes unexpectedly draw their strength from. But as a hope and a social resource, I wouldn't be so sure. Resilience, and quite some elements of this discourse you are citing, sometimes even sounds thoroughly ideological and even cynical, as when you cite the remark on war. We can do whatever we want to you, but don't worry, we trust that there will be resilience. This is the cynical element in it. So my question is whether the idea that there is a potential in resilience, how to get rid of these cynical or ideological elements here. My second question turns to the relation between life and resilience. With respect to life, I have to admit that I have a certain uneasiness with respect to the new prominence that the term life has become, which is also my chance to smuggle in the question that I had to Natalia this morning and that I couldn't raise. So let me give voice to this uneasiness. For an Arendtian, life is not the unpredictable, but the predictable. I mean, this is why Rodrigo said life is the unpredictable, where this kind of resilience might come from. It's not the unpredictable, but the predictable, the realm in which nothing changes, a realm of repetitiveness and violence. Whereas the new, the innovative, the wonder is only to be expected in the realm of human action, where action at the same time is exactly not sovereign action. So why turn to life, or why turn to bodies? Forgive me if my question seems to come too much from the outside of this discourse. But are these fights that Natalia convincingly referred to actually fights about life and bodies? Or aren't they fights about persons, people, human beings, embedded in a cultural form of life that are acting in order to defend their world, again to put in Arendtian terms and in the Arendtian opposition between the world and life? Aren't these people who want to live a life in decency and integrity? And is not resilience something that takes its resources from the wish to defend a specific shape of this world and a specific way of life and a specific relation to this world with its respective relation to self, but not life as such? So why would life be the locus of resilience? All we know about resilience in traumatic situations is that it doesn't rest on pure life, but on resources that individuals who are in danger of being reduced to pure life, or life as such, draw from their ongoing attachment to, again in Arendtian terms, the world, the form of life, the culturally shaped form of life, not life as such. Same, I would argue, holds for the concept of the body that we were talking about this morning. Why would one refer to the movements Natalia powerfully described as the appearance of bodies or as defending life? I want to argue that this is not the body as such that these movements defend. It is about the dignity of bodies. Injuries and abuse, according to my understanding, cannot happen to bodies but to embodied persons. It is also not the body as such that is violated through rape and/or exploitation. As we again know from a long history of inquiring into the logic of rape, It is more than the body that is abused. It is the integrity and dignity. And this doesn't only hold for the victim, but also for the perpetrator. What they go after is not bodies as such, again. It is bodies that are inextricably embedded in cultural norms and social meanings. Again, as an Arendtian as well as a Hegelian or Marxist, I was told that there is no such thing as mere survival. One never survives naked, as Hannah Arendt says, that is bare of one's form of life, a certain shape and form that life has taken. In other words, if one only survives naked, if it is only bare life that is left, this might not be life in a meaningful sense of the word at all. So again, why life? And why relating resilience to life? Why would it be life that has the potential to resist power? According to my view, this might be a self-misunderstanding. As Judith said this morning, we are already in a conceptual world here. I would say yes, definitely. And there is no way to avoid this, no outside of this conceptual world. So we might have to work with it and from within it. Thank you.
Stepping in. I think we do have now pieces of paper that some of you have handed in. Is that correct? With questions? And do we know where they are? Here's Mr. Vladimir Safatle. He will take it from here. Okay. But maybe before we take the audience questions, we might give Wendy and Rodrigo a brief chance to respond. And then we'll open it up to the larger audience, okay?
So, thank you. That was characteristically Rahel, incisive and brilliant and devastating. And I would actually like to return fire at length, but I know I already went on too long, so I'm not going to. I'll just say one or two things. I think that what we need to grasp today is what many have come to call, ironically, actually existing neoliberalism, which has little to do with the specific intentions of its intellectual advocates or architects. And yet, I want to suggest some strains of actually existing neoliberalism, including the iteration that you're absolutely right, needs historically specific accounting to explain why now, why at this conjuncture do we get an authoritarian turn, or a strong right turn, or a statist turn, or a protectionist nationalist turn. I'm not so interested in the question of whether it's the end or the continuation. I follow those debates. I think what interests me more, and is perhaps more important for figuring out where we are, is what of neoliberalism's rationalities have contoured and provoked elements of the present, and which ones perdure. The obvious things are continued deregulation, privatization, opposition to public goods, those sorts of things. There's a whole series of obvious ones. You particularly see it in the current regime in the U.S. There are discontinuities that obviously have to do with protectionism and nationalism. And bits of the right, and the scandals of capitalism, most recently in the so-called Paradise Papers, that discredit the whole thing. But more important to me than the continuity-discontinuity thing is something you and I have talked about before, and in full disclosure, Rahel has actually commented on a version of this paper before and has intensified and amplified her critique in the second round. My argument in a much longer version of what I'm trying to do here is that what we're really dealing with is neoliberalism's Frankenstein. That is to say, the monster that was produced, by no means intended by Hayek, Friedman, let alone the left-ish neoliberals, but that we can now, with the Owl of Minerva, see embedded in the rationality from the beginning. And that would take too long to outline, but that is really my answer to the question about continuity and discontinuity, and even in some ways my answer to the question about how freedom and authoritarianism go together. But I think I'll just stop. I have more to say, but I have a hunch that if we go on a long time, we'll never hear from our audience. So let me just say there's a longer discussion I look forward to over time, not only with Rahel, but with the arguments that you're offering me to sharpen my own.
In my paper, well, it wasn't me, Foucault makes clear and exposito how this paradoxical relationship between sovereignty and neoliberalism can work. So in that way, I think our papers in some way are related. I mean, we both talk about somehow this paradox between liberalism, neoliberalism, and authoritarianism. If my paper says something about it, I don't say anything about the relationship between this logic or rationality of resilience and authoritarianism, or sovereignty. It finishes there, but it doesn't say anything. And I was thinking about something that I read from Vladimir, who is there, in his book on O Circuito dos Afectos, so I'm right. And when he, I think, I don't know, he was criticized somebody, I don't remember whom, but he says something which I much agree, that there is no political without a body. The problem is which kind of body. So I will say that resilience, in a way, this way of thinking life without a body, is a form of cruelty. Of course, and you pointed out very well. It's a point of cruelty. But on the other hand, I will say that if life is confined to bodies that you cannot change, it's also another kind of cruelty. So I will say you can find cruelty in both sides. The problem is that maybe, and that's something I'm thinking right now here, the exaggeration of this bird life, paradoxically, you know, because there's a moment of body zero, let's say something like that, allows, you know, the sovereign body to come back with even more force. Because both logics are at the same time, you know. I mean, the resilience and Trump are living together. So maybe we have to think, and now I think what we heard this morning, other kind of bodies, you know, something in between this zero body of life and the return of the sovereign traditional body. You know? So, well, I don't know if I know. I'm sure I didn't answer your questions a little bit. That's what they make me think.
Ok, então eu gostaria de passar para duas perguntas da plateia. I would like to make two questions of the audience. The two questions is for Wendy Brown. No? The first one is, which values and actions could we assume in order to disrupt the path toward the authoritarianism in freedom's name and to revitalize the social sphere? No? This is the first one. It's small. Okay. Well, I will, okay.
I'll just say it again because maybe you didn't hear it. Which values and activities could we assume in order to disrupt the path towards the authoritarianism in freedom's name and revitalize the social sphere?
Yeah, but maybe I can also make the second. Then
Oh, okay.
Yes.
We'll just put them together.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, the second is, in your book, Undoing the Demos, you affirm that neoliberalism could be surpassed by another order of political and social reason. In that sense, the French authors Dardot and Laval think the concept of common as that alternative reason. What can you say about their conceptual alternative?
Okay. This is my weakness. I really mean it. So both of these magnificent questions are asking for strategies, alternatives, future visions, getting out of the darkness that is the place where I hang out, critically, intellectually. I'm actually a very sunny human being, but intellectually, that's the place where I go to the dark. So I will not satisfy, but I will say that the first question in some ways beautifully contains the answer in the question, that is revitalization of the social sphere. It seems to me that one of the ways that neoliberal rationality has been very successful is in this, if not demonizing the idea of society as Margaret Thatcher did, at least diminishing it as part, and I think Rahel alluded to this, diminishing our vocabulary and our apprehension, not just of social bonds and social obligations, which neoliberalism denies utterly, but more importantly, the very existence of social powers. The idea that it is through a vocabulary of social power that we become alert to inequalities, marginalizations, exclusions, subordinations, abjections, and through a vocabulary of social power that we also become capable of thinking about how to redress these things. The left certainly still has that language, but I think that the question for us now is how to bring a robust sense of social power, social bonds, social obligations, social justice out of its old and I think in some ways, I want to say almost petrified petrification, that kind of petrified vocabulary, and into one that's contemporary and that is capable of meeting both a right-wing and neoliberal discourse that seeks to disqualify it. Now, I don't have a clear sense of how to do that, but I do know that it's important to do in schools, in workplaces, in defending what remains of public goods, but above all, in articulating a vision of justice. And that's why I said I think the answer is contained in the question. Would the commons be one way to do this? It underwhelms me as a term, not because I'm against it, but because of its vagueness. I know that's also what's attractive to some people, the looseness and encompassing quality of the commons. But for me, as an old political economist, and not just a Foucauldian, this is where I want to go back to fighting with Rahel about ideology, but I'm not going to. As an old political economist, the commons doesn't quite do. I want a political economy of the commons, and then I want a political theory of our way of governing and organizing and ruling it so that we are not ruled by it. I want us to have a full and rich understanding of the political powers and political problems that face us in being together in an extraordinarily networked and interconnected and complex globe that can't be taken care of by the language of the commons. So sure, I'm for it, but it doesn't quite get at that rearticulation of the social, the importance of the political, the challenge for us in developing a communism or a socialism that is democratic and freedom-bearing for the 21st century.
Okay. Well, we have also a question to Rodrigo. No? Rodrigo, resilience could not open us for the possibility of the surveillance of each other. Surveillance of each other.
I can't understand it either.
Survey.
Do you have the question?
Yeah.
They'll hand it to you. It's really nice getting a piece of paper.
Yeah. Sorry.
Of course, in a way, because resilience, as I try to show, doesn't presuppose this system or this big brother from where we can be. What's the word? Be surveyed? No. How do you say in English? Being surveillance. Surveillance. So does not presuppose that place. So I will say that resilience forms part of other kinds of mutual surveillance, which are horizontal forms of surveillance. And so it doesn't need to think about this third place from where we can be a spy. That's one thing. But on the other hand, trying to think a little bit better, yes, because resilience, or at least that's what they say. No, I mean, I try to describe it from it. You know, so after, of course, we have to see how it works. You know? But the idea of resilience is to be confident. You know? Confident, and in this sense, it tries to get rid of this idea of fear, paranoid fear, I would say, that comes with liberalism, as Foucault says. But the problem, that's the hard thing to say, I would say, is that you cannot think resilience without the fact that now we're thinking of building new walls, which is a very old medieval way of protecting the territory. So that's why I think your paper, Wendy, it's very interesting to me, because I think we're trying to deal with the same kind of paradox. How those rationalities that seem absolutely different are in fact together, and in a way maybe they serve to legitimize each other. So yes, if you only think about resilience, of course, it's an optimistic, confident response, but on the other hand, what resilience legitimizes? That's the other problem, or what resilience enables also, and that's the other side, that we cannot forget.
I'm taking the liberty of asking a question myself, and it's this. Rahel at one point thought maybe we needed to undertake ideology critique in a new way. And Wendy, I think, referred to ideology as distortion at one point. And I, of course, have been accused of producing a gender ideology. And my first thought was just to say, no, I haven't done that. I'm against that. But in that accusation, ideology is a dogma, right? It's a dogma, and it's an illusion, and it's a dogma. And I'm just wondering whether we are still within the sphere of Marx's the German ideology, and I'm trying to think about these different senses, because I think many of us felt like we had to depart from the notion of ideology because it either committed us to Althusser in a way that we were unwilling to be committed, or it took us back to the German ideology and a base superstructure model that we didn't want to subscribe to. Or perhaps we followed Habermas and thought we needed to move from ideology to communicative action, and that was a better way of understanding the symbolic sphere more broadly. And I'm just thinking about it, obviously for my own reasons, but in terms of the idea of resilience as a form of rationality, or neoliberalism as a form of rationality. Does that do the work that ideology once did? Is it separate from the idea of ideology? And why, Rahel, would you perhaps like us to return to ideology critique, or still see a kind of productive value? You don't have to answer that if you're not interested.
So I'm just going to say 2 or 3 things. One is that it seems to me in the era of fake news, we have surpassed ideology and ideology critique in any sense of the word. That is to say, the service of ideology, whether it was from the German ideology, a systematic inversion of society at the level of representation, or whether we move toward Foucault through Althusser, where it does have the productive world-making dimensions that Rahel suggested. It seems to me that at the point at which we're no longer simply talking about a false representation of society, but simply false, just false, not representation, not of society, nothing else, but where it's a matter of indifference. I don't know exactly what ideology critique in any of the old senses would do. But the second thing I want to say is that I think that in the case of gender ideology, or the ideology of gender, the accusation is that there's a truth of gender, and then there's an ideology of gender, and you're right, that's in the shadow of Marxism. And the third thing I want to say is that what seems to me useful about Foucault's critique of ideology is his insistence that no matter how you spin it, there is always beneath or there was always somewhere the real, that even if ideology is productive, there is also still something real. There's something that ideology is, if not distorting, at least it's misrepresenting, or it's reifying, or it's fetishizing, or it's doing something. And it seems to me that as important as it is to hold on to that in many dimensions of life, that what Foucault usefully taught us in thinking about power's relationship to truth, originally through episteme, then through discourse, then through the notion of political rationality, was that what these things do is make worlds and make truths and make reality principles that don't have some other referent, some other real. And that, it seems to me, is what is so important to grasp about neoliberalism. And I'm not accusing you of this, Rahel, but so many of my Marxist comrades and colleagues want to insist that neoliberalism is but an ideology about a form of capitalism rather than a particular way of making the world, the subject, politics, remaking the state, and remaking us and our subjectivity through a reality principle and through a truth that governs us that does not have some other real. And that's what's horrifying, that's what's dark, but that doesn't mean it's total, and that doesn't mean it's incontestable. It just means it's not ideology. That's my response.
Answer to your first remark, I would say that no, you're not. I mean, whatever you're doing, the people who accuse you of doing gender ideology are using the term in a very unspecific sense, or in the sense that Geuss alluded to as, ideology as some kind of a dogma or a positive sense of ideology. So this is not the kind of ideology and ideology critique that I have in mind. And a very short answer to the second question is yes, I would suggest to go back to not go back, but to come up with some kind of ideology critique for two reasons. I know about all the problems, the obstacles, the drawbacks with respect to classical Marxist ideology critique. But I would say it is a certain way, and this reflects your remarks on critique and crisis in our Berkeley discussion. It is a certain way to come up with normative standards that is immanent, that is informed by crisis and contradictions and blockages of experience with respect to these contradictions that can then serve as a normative, as a starting point for criticizing these social formations. And this is why I think it's interesting, because there are not so many options in order to, and then I would say, yes, it is a practice. It's not like just a delusion, it's not irrationality. It is not only embedded, but constitutive of practices and institutions, which is the Althusserian lesson. But I would, push a bit further with respect to where to draw the normative resources for certain ideas of emancipation from. And this is why, long story short answer, yes.
Let's see if Rodrigo wants to say something.
This is actually a question for Rodrigo in response to your question.
Great. He's the boss.
I almost got to show you how walking around. Okay, so here's what, here, maybe we all have a conversation about ideology and alternative ways
Well, just one last question, but before it, I would like just to make a very important remark. The Robocop tree was made by a Brazilian. It's very important. No? But by the way, it's the last question to Wendy Brown. No? The question is, Nancy Fraser addressed the idea that neoliberalism has individualized social demands. But recently, the so-called progressive neoliberalism has, in a certain way, has come to the end. No? How do you see this idea?
Bom, agradecemos então as falas de Wendy Brown, Rahel Jaeggi e Rodrigo de la Fábian. E aproveitamos para agradecer a presença de todas e de todos. Ficamos por aqui hoje. Lembramos que retomaremos a programação do seminário Os Fins da Democracia, amanhã, a partir das 10h30, com Zeynep Gambet, com um trabalho intitulado A Condição Pós-Totalitária, e Rahel Jaeggi, que fará uma fala sobre os modos da regressão, o caso do resentment, tendo como debatedor Jimmy Casas Clausen, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro. Muito obrigado, bom descanso a todas e a todos, e até amanhã.